Hello and welcome to another short revision lesson looking at the impact of war on Britain, in particular conscription and volunteering and what impact those things had on everyday people's lives. So let's start by recapping conscription in World War One. At the start of the war, men were persuaded to join the army through the use of posters and peer pressure. So there's lots of propaganda posters showing different reasons why men should enlist. And it was initially very successful. Lord Kitchener, who'd been in charge of the campaign, had initially set out to get about 100,000 men, which he thought would be sufficient for the war effort because they believed it would be over very quickly in a matter of months by Christmas. But as the war went on, however, the numbers of men volunteering fell as news of conditions at the front line and high number of casualties put people off joining the war effort. So obviously over time, PALS battalions was another method that they tried to use to get people to join up with your mates, it's going to be fun. They also use things like, stand up for your country, defending your families or women, children, etc. But as we said, the high number of casualties put people off joining the war even so. As a result, the government introduced conscription in 1916, and that's where they were forcing people by law to join the army. The Military Services Act made all unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 41 eligible for military service. In May 1916, this extended to all married men as well. A total of 3.5 million men were conscripted to go and fight. The only exceptions were if the men were in mining or farming jobs, because those were seen as essential in the UK. Men were ill and therefore unable to fight. Men had family responsibilities like looking after an elderly parent who could look after themselves, or looking after children, being a single father, or if they were a conscientious objector. Now, being a conscientious objector we'll look at a little bit more. So conscientious objectors were people who refused to fight on religious or moral grounds. So there were around about 16,000 men during World War One who said that they wouldn't, despite being called to enlist in the army, they refused to do so on religious or moral grounds. And they were forced to appear in front of a military tribunal. So effectively it's like a court case because what they were doing was illegal. Legally, the government required all men to fight if they were asked to, if they were between 18 and 41 and weren't exempt. Of the 16,000 men who objected to fighting on religious or moral grounds, about half of them, so 8,000, chose to help the war effort in another way. So, for example, doing work behind the lines, essential war work that didn't involve fighting. So, for example, they might go out with the armed forces, but they were a stretcher bearer rather than someone with a gun who might be required to kill or maim. The remainder of the conscientious objectors, so about 8,000, were sent to prison, where they were often treated with great cruelty. For example, at the Home Office Work Centre in Dyson, Aberdeen, the men were given tents as their only accommodation, and it was very, very cold. So in winter conditions, several caught pneumonia and died. In total, 10 objectors died in prison, 63 died soon after their release, and 31 suffered from mental health conditions as a result of their treatment. So prisoners, or the 8,000 who were sent into prisons, would have had a very different experience to those perhaps who did essential war work like stretcher bearing or helping with medical things on the front lines. You can see different sources here that you might come across. So we've got the conscientious objectors here at the Dice Work Centre. Obviously the image doesn't give away a lot about the very poor conditions that they would have been living in there. We've got a letter from a military commander of a detention barracks at Wandsworth. I had them placed in special rooms with the full army kit, but nothing else. So they had to stay in these rooms until they chose to put their army kit on, and it was a way of trying to force men into joining the army. There's an interview with a conscientious objector in 1928. So this is 10 years after the end of the war. Our ankles were tied together, our arms tightly tied, wrists crossed, and they had to hold that position for 2 hours. They had their face in barbed wire fences. They're really, really badly treated. And all of this is to try and force them into feeling guilty, perhaps choosing instead to go to war. And also because the people who were left behind perhaps were treating them badly because they felt these people were acting in a cowardly way. They didn't necessarily understand their moral reasons for objecting to fight. So that was a large phenomena in World War One. In World War One, volunteers was something else that was really important and relied upon, as well as conscription and laws against things like conscientious objection. So, for example, 90,000 volunteers worked at home and abroad during World War One, which is a huge number. They provided vital aid to naval and military forces, caring for the sick, wounded sailors and soldiers. And it included groups like Voluntary Aid Detachments, or VADs. They were branches of the Red Cross, and so they would go out and they would help give medical aid. They were made up of, VADs were men and women, and they had a range of positions, including nursing, transport duties, so helping transport goods and things that were needed, organising rest stations, working parties, and auxiliary hospitals. So hospitals in areas where they weren't normally. They're setting up these hospitals. Could be like field hospitals. Could be in places in the UK even, if it was necessary after things like the Blitz bombings in major cities. Training. At the outbreak of war, many people were inspired to train to help the sick and the wounded. Women were needed to be taught first aid so that they could help at home. Home nursing and hygiene, and they took classes in cookery. Men were trained in first aid, in field and stretcher bearing, because they'd be more likely to come across injuries like that in their combat roles. Talented VADs, the members of the Red Cross, could take specialist classes to become a masseuse or an X-ray machine user to help find shrapnel in bodies of those injured during the explosions on the front lines. VADs had to pass exams to receive their first aid and home nursing certificates. Special service as well. So in February 1915, the War Office proposed that volunteers could help at Military Royal Army Medical Corps, the RAMC, hospitals. And these had previously been staffed exclusively by army nurses and orderlies from the RAMC. So during the First World War, they decided that actually they could have non-army volunteers as well to help with the needs that they had. The first request from military hospitals for these special service VADs in England came in early 1915 from France and in May of the same year. And these were quickly followed by demands from Malta and Egypt as well. So they really required a lot of help with volunteers to help with nursing and doctors on the front lines. A general service section of the VADs was established in September 1915. As men went off to fight, VADs were supplied in their place, carrying out their roles as dispensers, clerks, cooks and storekeepers. And by 1919, 11,000 men had been released from active service and replaced replaced by women. So VADs were becoming increasingly women as the number of men required to fight on the front lines increased. VADs were sent abroad during both World Wars, and to countries like France, Italy and Russia. Male detachments were frequently sent to France to work as transport officers and orderlies in hospitals. Working parties. On the outbreak of the First World War, local Red Cross working parties formed across the country with cooperation of the surrounding villages. They organised the supply of hospital clothing, including socks, shirts, blankets and belts for soldiers, and they also made essential hospital equipment such as bandages, splints, swabs and clothing. So all of these things were absolutely essential for the medical work, so volunteers were essential for that. Work depots were established in every major town to collate and dispatch clothing from working parties, and items were sent to the Red Cross headquarters or directly to soldiers in auxiliary hospitals at home and abroad. Air raid duty. VADs undertook air raid duty in London, so voluntary aid detachments, so groups of people would be in charge of organising things when their air raid sirens went off. The emblem of the Red Cross seemed to inspire a certain feeling of confidence in the crowds which gathered in the underground railway stations and shelters. Armed with a respirator, the VADs could perform first aid on people who were injured in the blasts. Rest stations were also run, so at railway stations the VADs provided food and other supplies for soldiers arriving by ambulance train, whilst they awaited to be transported to local hospitals or to travel on to other destinations. and transport. The first ever motorised ambulances, so the first ambulances as we would know them, as sort of cars and things like that, to transport wounded people, were used during the First World War. The Times, the newspaper, appealed for ambulance funds in October 1914, raising enough for Britain to buy 512 vehicles within 3 weeks, which is really, really significant. So that shows the sort of high morale and people pulling together in that war effort. Male detachments were almost entirely in charge of transporting sick and wounded soldiers from ambulance trains or ships to local hospitals, and they also ferried patients between hospitals. Male volunteers were also frequently sent to France to work as ambulance drivers, often coming under fire as they transported men away from the front. And 3 hospital trains in France carried 461,844 patients throughout the war. Hospital ships and barges were also used to transport patients. So there's huge numbers of volunteer roles in World War I, which were probably equally as significant as those conscripted into the armed forces. Conscription was also used in World War II. So it was introduced before World War II even actually officially started. In April 1939, at first men were supposed to serve 6 months at a time, but most stayed in the armed forces until the end of the war. Between May 1939 and the autumn of 1941, all men aged between 18 and 52, so it's a larger group here than we'd seen in World War I, were conscripted. There were few complaints about conscription in World War II. Some men did not have to fight because of the importance of their occupation, if they were in mining or agricultural work. But over 1 million men volunteered before they were even called up by their papers. So actually, conscription was something quite popular in World War II. There were 2 main differences between World War I and World War II. From the start of the war, all men between 18 and 41 had to register for work, either to fight or work in a reserve occupation. And in December 1941, conscription of women was also introduced. So all men had some kind of key role throughout the entire war in World War II. So they didn't just wait for conscription. They could sign up for either the army or for essential war work. And then we see conscription of women from December 1941, which is new in World War II. At first, this only applied to unmarried women between 20 and 30, but the minimum age was lowered to 19 and the maximum to 43 in 1943, as there was more and more need for women due to the casualties of the men at the front and them needing to release men from work at home to go and fight abroad. Women were also mobilised as volunteers in World War II as well. So in World War II, they were mobilised in different ways. Most women from 1941, unless they were pregnant or had small children, were sent to work in industry, so in factories, doing jobs like munitionettes to produce things that would be needed for fighting on the front lines, and then also in auxiliary armed services. So auxiliary meaning sort of extra to the ordinary fighting that was happening. So by 1943, 90% of all single women and 80% of married women were in work of national importance, which is a huge increase on what had been seen before. The WAAF was the Women's Air Force, the WRNS was the Women's Navy, WAAF was Women's Army, the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Land Army, farmed work. So all of these were jobs that women were volunteering to do. The most popular types of jobs for women to volunteer to do were the ones which had uniforms which seemed to be exciting. So especially in their 20s and 30s, these are young women who were looking for interesting ways to contribute to the war effort. So we see by 1944, 450,000, so nearly 500,000 women in the armed services as a result of this. However, only 80,000 women were actually working for the Land Army. They had dull, sort of khaki, greeny-brown uniforms that seemed less exciting than the official uniforms of the Navy and the Air Force and things like that. So less women wanted to do the Land Army, the farming jobs. They seemed less glamorous. This was a huge amount less than the 260,000 women who'd worked for the Land Army in World War I. The success of getting people involved in these voluntary jobs required the jobs to be exciting. Despite not being involved in combat, women did hard and often dangerous jobs too, so they worked as mechanics, welders, pilots, carpenters and munitionettes in factories. In lots of these jobs, they could end up getting injured or killed in some cases by either poisonous chemicals in munition factories, or if there are accidents when they're working with dangerous tools, chemicals and explosives. Voluntary services in World War II. Many women entered the voluntary services, as we've mentioned. By September 1943, there were more than 1 million women in the women's voluntary service. 180,000 women working in civil defence in the government, replacing jobs which men had been doing to release them to go and work in combat roles on the front lines. 47,000 women working in fire services, absolutely essential work back home. If the men were being freed to go and do jobs elsewhere, especially when you consider in World War II we've got the Blitz, so there may well have been lots of incendiary bombs which caused fires that would need putting out. 130,000 women serving as messengers and dispatch riders from the post office, and some women running nurseries, driving ambulances and working in medical centres as well. So there are lots of ways that both the government and volunteers ensured that the war effort was successful in both World War I and World War II. That's the end of this short revision video. Good luck with your revision, and don't forget to have a go at some exam style questions.